Rayburn.
Yeah.
You were very helpful.
The hearing may resume, and we are now at the part of our agenda where we will ask Mr. Shabbat to begin his questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And this question is to any or all of the witnesses, whoever would like to respond. Is the relationship between the Internet service providers and content providers, isn't it mutually beneficial? And practically speaking, consumers can't, can't access content without network, and a network serves no purpose without content to distribute and consumer demand. How does government involvement help this already quite successful relationship, and how would the consumer be impacted by changes in that dynamic at this time? And yes, Professor?
It's an interesting question. You would think that the two would be mutually helpful to each other. Actually, there's economic evidence by our colleagues Barbara Van Schewick and Brett Frischman, a joint paper making clear that network access providers have every incentive actually to discriminate against content not their own in order to further their own business plans. Again, the idea is you've got an incumbent with an existing powerful business that it wants to protect at almost any cost, even if it might be better for the network as a whole if they collaborated with content providers. A second point is that the Internet is not just content being passively sent to subscribers. The great glory of the Internet is that this is an interactive, often user-generated network that allows for a lot of other communications that can't be described as content.
Okay, thank you. Professor, you?
They are mutually beneficial, and for the most part. And it's one of these things that's actually reflected in Supreme Court precedent, going back to the vertical integration between networks and content providers all the way back. And the Supreme Court used to be extremely hostile towards the idea. They're thinking, oh, this would be a big, having the network own the content could lead to all these harms. Well, what's happened in Supreme Court doctrine with regard to vertical integration and vertical restraints is it's become much more permissive. Why? Because this is often extremely efficient behavior. Particularly in the Internet, sometimes a very tight integration between the content and the network can actually increase the functionality of the network. The best example I know of is the wireless industry. One of the things, if I were walking across this room, I would pass through hot spots and cold spots as I walk through, depending on the bandwidth I get. What the wireless industry will often do is give me my voice communications constantly all the way through as I walk through the room. And if I'm at a cold spot, it'll hold my email. Why? I can't stand my voice traffic being interrupted for even a third or a quarter of a second, or else I won't use it. Now, when I get to the hotspot, they'll dump me all my email at once. Is that neutral? No. Does it require a very tight integration between the content, the device, and the application and the network? Absolutely. But it's a way to yield real benefits to consumers in ways that are very concrete. And you see this in an empirical study that's fascinating. They've done 2 large studies by the FTC staff to look when that kind of tight integration yields benefits. One looked at 17 full studies that always increased consumer welfare. And in the other study, 16 out of 17 times it increased consumer welfare. And if you look at over the last 2.5 years, the FCC has examined it and said, this is not a problem, despite the filings in every single case in 5 major regulatory matters. Is there a small theoretical possibility of some harm? Yes. It depends on very specific empirical conditions, which is why I think I've always supported a case-by-case analysis instead of saying this isn't a problem, should go away. But we should make sure that the circumstances for that anti-competitive conduct exist before we stop these kinds of practices, which can yield real benefits to consumers.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to touch on it, or should I go to another question? I'll go to another question. How do networks deal with innovation, and how would technology be impacted by additional government involvement, and would consumers benefit from more regulation? Anybody is welcome to it. Ms. Fredrickson?
Well, I mean, I think our perspective is that net neutrality rules are less regulation. They allow the Internet to flourish in a very free fashion, but you have to set some basic non-discriminatory policy to get in so that those ISPs can't control and limit the content. I think Ms. Combs, as I said earlier, had already laid out numerous examples where there has already been discrimination undertaken by ISPs. So I would differ with Professor Yu and say that it's not theoretical, it's not hypothetical, it actually exists. And therefore, we need to ensure that the internet remains unconstrained and free and foments innovation and competitiveness rather than limits it by allowing ISPs to shut down competing services and content that they might disfavor.
Okay. Thank you. Professor Yu and Professor Crawford, if you could get in very quickly because my time's over.
Just very quickly, we're talking about telco incumbents. One of their last great innovations was call waiting. We haven't seen a lot of innovation coming from the network providers. What's been happening is an explosion of innovation at the edge, and it is that innovation that net neutrality furthers.
Thank you. Professor Yu.
Just the story that Ms. Fredrickson told about the early days of the internet, I assume you're talking about the computer inquiries and the first generation of regulation. What's fascinating is we did have non-discrimination rules, but the telcos, when they had a new development, constantly had to come asking for waivers. For example, shifting from analog transmission to digital transmission. You had to change the network, and all of a sudden, the things that were digital didn't communicate with the things that were analog anymore. When we had a restrictive rule in the place that defined non-discrimination in a very particular way, any time a network needed to innovate, they had to come get a waiver and get a special dispensation. Call waiting was retarded by the fact that they had to get a special waiver because call waiting is provided by the computer processing in the switch. That's the cheapest way to do it. Well, that was non-neutral because the telephone company had an advantage, but it was a natural advantage in the technology. And we had these battles under that world where they were constantly fighting over what was permitted under the rules until finally we shifted the regime to saying, the FCC said, we should get out of this. The real solution here is competition.
Thank you very much. And my time has expired. I yield back, bounce my time.
Gentleman yields back. I have really a question. I was interested, I'm sorry, I ran over to vote. I didn't get to hear your testimony, but I did read the testimony, Professor Crawford. And I have a concern with Comcast's recent issues with BitTorrent, and just thinking, where does this lead if you regulate uploads or charge for uploads, or what does that do to the innovation that we're finding on the internet? And does that pose, in your judgment, pretty severe First Amendment issues?
Thank you, Congresswoman. It's a wonderful question because the great value add of the internet comes from the ability to upload, not just to be passive consumers of content. For all of us, without asking permission, to create our own movies, our own new applications, our own new ways of making a living. Having an asymmetric network, like the one that Comcast has intentionally built, is very destructive to that kind of innovation. I'll note that in Japan and in France, all over the world, they're building symmetric networks that are moving for uploads at 100 times the speed we have available in the United States. So just as a matter of national pride as well as innovation, we should care about our ability to upload.
All right. Professor Yu, do you disagree?
Well, I do think it's important, but what's fascinating about the Comcast example is it's not just about uploads. I mean, consider OK Go's success on YouTube. YouTube is not a peer-to-peer technology. It is a classic file server technology where it's all hosted one place. So in a way, what BitTorrent is not trying to do is to go against user-generated content. What they created was a very nicely crafted world in which they didn't block it across any application across the whole network. They found a handful of nodes at certain times where they were bogging down with congestion and found a way to slow down the uploads when there was no human being on the other end. And the beauty of BitTorrent is it probably didn't even hurt the people who were attempting to download at the same time, because the genius of BitTorrent is it'll go get those bits someplace else. So it was actually potentially a very finely crafted idea. I agree with Professor Crawford that the user-generated content world is very exciting, but in many ways, things like what Comcast did to BitTorrent is essential to preserving the YouTube style of file server user-generated content to make sure that the peer-to-peer style doesn't congest the entire internet.
One of the things, with this net neutrality debate is not a new one for the Congress. And last year we went through this, and matter of fact, I was telling my staff that I sort of toyed with the idea of playing the Ask a Ninja net neutrality rather than actually asking the questions, but I was discouraged from doing so. I do have a concern that if you start allowing the pipes to really decide who gets to see what, you end up sort of cableizing the internet in a way that it is not the way we've had the internet. I met with Vint Cerf last week out at Google. I mean, this was, the internet is to be free. It's always been that way, and has only been threatened recently. Do you think the concern about turning the internet into cable is overblown, Professor, or?
No, I don't, Congresswoman. As I've said, I think we really stand at a turning point. And a visual picture I often use is that it's as if the sidewalk has gotten tired of being a sidewalk and wants to rise up and take a little ka-ching, monetize the conversations we're having if they're particularly valuable or if they think they can price discriminate with respect to that sidewalk. As a society, we need basic infrastructure. We need to invest in it. We need to move forward as a country with this basic infrastructure. Communications policy should be part of our industrial policy and move us forward as a country. And net neutrality is a central part. This is a Sputnik moment for us. And I think Vint Cerf would agree that just as the fear of what was going on with the Russians drove us to create the internet, we've now got an internal Sputnik development, which is our own market powerful ISPs controlling innovation on the internet.
I'll just close by thanking all the witnesses. It was fun to talk to Mr. Kulash. If I didn't get a chance to talk to you, Mr. Carnes, I appreciate your coming all this way. And I also wanted to say something, Ms. Combs, to you, because I respect that a conservative person such as yourself would say that you agree with somebody that you completely disagree with on the issues to stand up for free speech. And, doubtless there are many things we don't agree on, but I really do respect that you are here standing up for the First Amendment here today, and it's a very honorable thing that you're doing. Thank you very much. Mr. Keller.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Let's see, Professor Crawford, you made the analogy about having one road rather than the many-tiered system like at Disneyland, and you caught my attention there since I represent Disney World in Orlando. So let me ask you a pretty basic question. One of the concerns that has been raised is that ISPs want to provide tiered service to consumers that utilize higher amounts of bandwidth. And the DOJ, in its comments to the FCC, said, and I'll just quote it, mandating a single uniform level of service for all content could limit the quality and variety of services that are available to consumers and discourage investment in new facilities, close quote. Are you in favor of a tiered service, or do you feel that a single tier is always the best for consumers?
Let's be clear about our terms here, Congressman. I think that no one would disagree on the net neutrality side that it makes sense to charge consumers for use of bandwidth, and that discriminating against consumers in that way seems appropriate. If you're using more, charge more. It's that business model that our current ISPs don't want to move towards. What I am against is the idea of discriminating against particular applications because of what they do or particular sources or content of packets. I am also personally concerned about trying to draw categories of applications and say, your video, you go at X speed, all video goes at that speed. Here's the problem with drawing those categories. The ISP is in the position of being the line drawer, and we'll have all kinds of new things that will appear in the world. We don't want to give these very consolidated entities the power to decide who falls in what category.
All right, well, let me, Professor Yu, let me follow up with you. You were at Vanderbilt at the same time I was at Vanderbilt, I see, and you gave me a C in antitrust, and now I have some questions for you. And just kidding. I didn't take your classes when I was there, but too hard of classes. But let me begin with you, Professor Yu. If a broadband provider chooses to degrade certain content, do consumers have other options to turn to for their broadband service?
I think the wireless option tells us yes, is that we have a world in which that's a real possibility for the first time. And there's wonderful data coming out of Europe and OECD looking at the impact that non-discrimination and access requirements have on building out new networks, which is the real goal. And we discovered that it's retarding it, actually. If you look, it's correlated when you have those sorts of access requirements, you get less new broadband extended to new areas, and that's an enormous problem. If I may, the one reaction I had to what Professor Crawford said is that it's often said that the bloggers would be hurt by the fast lane and the slow lane. What's fascinating to me is I actually think that has it backwards. Creating a fast lane and a slow lane is a way to protect the bloggers. Why? People who are just sending text don't need the fast lane. It's the video that needs the fast lane. And if right now we're charging all a certain price, if we're going to upgrade the network at all, we can either charge everyone a higher price for the upgrade or create a tiered service where the bloggers can still keep the price they're getting and only charge the people who need the faster service for video for what they're getting. Because this is a way to keep people like the bloggers online, not to hurt them.
Okay, and let me get back with you, but let me touch on the piracy issue just a little bit, and we'll give both of our artists a chance. Mr. Carnes, what is the relationship between online piracy and network congestion?
Well, I said previously that 5% of the users on the internet are using up 70% of the broadband network, and 90% of that is illegal P2P. So congestion is actually piracy. You know, piracy is the disease, and network congestion is just a symptom of that disease.
All right, and Mr. Kulash, I know that you got your big break from the video that you showed, the famous treadmill video. Let me ask you, did you get that video on the first take, or did that take a while to?
Take 13, sir.
Take 13. All right. Tell me, since you're an artist who obviously I know you get your revenue, at least some, from performance royalties. Do you have concerns about preventing online piracy?
Absolutely. You know, I believe, as every songwriter believes, I think as everyone believes, that that musicians should be paid for their work. I'm certainly not advocating anything that I think will lead to piracy. The question is, who is going to build that new system for music distribution, for how we listen to music, how we get to make music? It seems to me that the telcos are not the people I want building that system.
Okay, Professor Crawford, you just wanted to respond?
Just very briefly, with a couple of empirical points. When we talk about competition from the wireless sector in this country, we should remember that those companies are owned by the same companies that control DSL access, that we have a very highly concentrated market when it comes to internet access as a whole, same actors. Also, on the video point, we need a larger principle moving forward for this entire discussion. We cannot focus ourselves on what's going on with internet video right now. We've got 100 years ahead of us for internet history, and we have to set the terms now. Also, finally, on the filtering point here, I think it will be, as Mr. Kulash has said, inappropriate for the ISP to be the level where filtering takes place. The content application providers can do this. They'll have some knowledge of who they're having license arrangements with, and they can respond to notices and take down procedures under the DMCA. We've set up this structure, and it can work. Thanks.
The gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank all of you for being here today and helping us tackle this very thorny issue. You know, obviously, everybody's concerned about the internet and its ever-evolving status, and we want to continue to see it be a source of innovation and a strength for our economy, which is a little bit shaky right now. And I supported network neutrality in the 109th Congress because I was really concerned that there was not enough competition in the marketplace to start cordoning off sections of the internet and adding a premium to the price of that section. I mean, to me, it made sense to do that, to prevent that from happening through network neutrality, so that you don't have ISPs striking up deals in favor of one set of providers over another and limiting the competition and making choices for consumers, because that's counterintuitive to what the internet is supposed to be. But you know, so we're members of this antitrust task force, but we're also members of the Judiciary Committee, and we deal with legislation related to crime as well. And the concern that I have about network neutrality is that you'd never want to force ISPs to actively ignore conduct that is unlawful or speech that they know is unprotected. And what I mean by that is piracy or child pornography. I mean, I sponsored legislation that some of you may be familiar with that would address the 500,000 known individuals in the United States who are trading and trafficking in child pornography on the internet. And we're talking about images of young children being raped and victimized. I mean, we're talking, these are crime scene photos, and that those are being shared through peer-to-peer file sharing all over the country every single day, and law enforcement knows who they are, knows where they could find them, but they're just overwhelmed and outnumbered. And the legislation that I sponsored and that was adopted unanimously out of this committee, out of the Congress, was, not unanimously, with 2 no votes. Let me be accurate. Was designed to make sure that we could get those resources into the system and go after people who are breaking the law and who are going well beyond the bounds of speech. So the question that I have, we want to include socially responsible behavior from internet service providers, but we want to make sure they manage their networks in such a way that they can eliminate piracy and the spread of child pornography over peer-to-peer networks. So that's a long preface to my question, and I'd like any of you to answer it. How do we fashion principles that will continue internet innovation, but that also will not prohibit corporations from addressing this kind of unlawful activity or unprotected speech? Because I want ISPs to be able to cordon off access to that kind of peer-to-peer file sharing, and when they identify where these people are and can shut off their access, I don't want network neutrality to prevent them from being able to do that.
Congresswoman, if I could respond briefly. The creation of child pornography is the most heinous behavior we know of around the world. It's incredibly destructive, and the closest thing we have actually to a global norm is an abhorrence of child pornography. We need to remember, though, that we're addressing 2 different things: behavior on the one hand and technology on the other. The behavior of child porn creators, we always prosecute, we make sure we go after. Fashioning technology in advance to look for a particular flesh tone or a particular action in a packet crossing an ISP network is going to be both incredibly difficult and probably destructive to some sense of innovation. So here's my response to you. The ISPs cooperate quite closely with law enforcement all the time, and it is in facilitating that cooperation that we go after the behavior without punishing the technology that makes so much else that is good and positive in the world to happen.
I can understand pursuing the behavior. We can't just leave it to punishing the behavior here. We have to make sure that that you limit the market. I mean, and if you limit access to the market will shrink, and the reduction in the competitive exchange will cause less need for the market to be fed by more crime. So
I agree with you. I think it's just a question of timing. I'm saying that ISPs cooperate with law enforcement, hear about what's going on, and then act to either take off subscribers.
A child's already been victimized when you do it that way. Yeah. We're talking about children who are being raped, children who are being victimized. So waiting till after that's happened hurts children.
How could we do it before? How would you know where the file was before
What I'm
this
talking
happened?
about, they already have the technology to know where the file is, to know the servers that are on there. I mean, if we had the resources, they can go and find the digital fingerprints, from what I understand. They have the technology to lift those now and find them, and it's only due to the lack of resource. And I just wouldn't want, like I said, I'm a proponent of network neutrality, but I certainly am not a proponent of illegal network neutrality benefiting the promotion of illegal activity. And after the fact is not okay when it comes to harming children.
Congresswoman, basically, I mean, I certainly in total agreement that the illegal activity that's going on the internet, we need to have some cap on that, some control in some way. And in terms of net neutrality, they're talking about like having a level playing field. And that sounds really nice, but what we've got now is not a level playing field. We've got a playing field that's tilted. Just like you're saying, these people are overwhelmed. They can't begin to control 500,000 different cases. The network is set up right now, tilted in favor of...
The gentlelady's time has expired, and I would turn now to the former chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Sensenbrenner, for his
Thank you very much. Ms. Combs, I was interested in your comments about the blocking of a political message during a performance that was streamed over the internet, and the analogy to the same type of blocking of religious messages by the thought police in the People's Republic of China. Could you amplify a little bit more about how these actions were similar?
You mean the Pearl Jam concert?
Yes.
Well, I think they're just...
Please turn your mic on or bring it a little closer.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I just think they're both examples of discriminatory behavior on the internet, because they're blocking, even though we as an organization do not agree with probably what Pearl Jam was saying in their concert.
And neither do I, but
No, but it's just an example of discriminatory behavior that they did try to stop the concert. And we believe it is the exact same discriminatory behavior that is being used by the Chinese government to block our message to getting to the Chinese citizens that would like to see and hear some of our messages that we're trying to put out. We just don't want that to happen. We are constantly sending out email blasts. We're constantly getting our message out to our thousands of supporters across the country, and we don't want Comcast or Verizon or one of the large companies to do that to our organization.
well, as you know from my opening remarks, my interest in internet neutrality has been more focused on the antitrust and monopolistic aspects of non-neutrality than the content that has been intercepted, jammed, blocked, or whatever. Because a free market economy, in my opinion, is based upon healthy competition, and America was the first country in the world to pass antitrust laws, largely aimed at busting up the Standard Oil Trust. But those antitrust laws, I think, have worked fairly well to protect consumers in the United States, contrasted to antitrust laws in Europe and elsewhere that is designed to protect competition. That said, what do you think Congress should do to protect consumers, such as those that wish to receive your message, whether they be in the People's Republic of China or elsewhere, or somebody who wishes to get a brief political message from Pearl Jam?
We just believe that every organization out there, whether they be NARAL or the Christian Coalition or the ACLU, we don't believe that Comcast and Verizon and these companies should have the ability to block our message.
Okay, now, do you think that a better way to police that principle is through having the FCC or another federal agency regulate content on the Internet, or to give you or other aggrieved parties the right to sue the ISP for treble damages if they are engaging in monopolistic practices that prevent the people who wish to receive your message from getting it?
We just believe that there should be a free and open Internet to all consumers, and that they should have the right to receive any emails coming from any organization, you know, whether now.
Okay. My question, with all due respect, Ms. Combs, is what's the best way to do it? Because that's what the debate is here in the Congress, whether we should be utilizing the antitrust laws, which will get you some money if you end up being aggrieved upon, or having to go to the Federal Communications Commission or another agency to try to get them to say that somebody broke the regulations.
Right. I'm not familiar with all those laws. I'm going to, if okay, if Professor Crawford answers this question.
Okay. This is now a 50-yard punt, and who would return the Ms. Fredrickson?
I think, with all due respect, Mr. Sensenbrenner, well, first off, I would also like to say that Ms. Combs and I, the ACLU and the Christian Coalition, have worked together on many issues, not simply on net neutrality, so I wanted to set the record straight on that. But I think the issue here, the concern is that with all of the many small players on the Internet, the variety of content producers who are making videos in their backyard or putting up their own website or doing things that are very small in scale but can reach a very wide audience, I think that the burden of trying to sue is a heavy one to bear, and that there should be, whatever the framework is, should be some neutrality principles that govern from the beginning, from the outset, that ensure that there is some level playing field.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you very much, and I thank the presiding chair, and I thank Mr. Conyers as well for this ongoing series of important discussions and debates about the utilization of this technology and this question of that is before us. Let me start, first of all, I find it fascinating, and I think you're absolutely right, Ms. Fredrickson, that I've seen the Christian Coalition, the ACLU, work together, and I think it's important to note that the ACLU is known for finding the most prickly of adversaries and working with them, and you're to be commended for it. Seriously, that you circle the wagons around issues and not around the views of others. And Ms. Combs, I'm not suggesting in any way that you are prickly. Don't want the record to reflect that, and it should not, because I appreciate the advocacy of which you stand for. I am going to probe Professor Yu to give him a fighting chance to try to understand, because the one thing I like about this task force is that we tried to strike a reasoned balance. I'm moved, however, by the words of Professor Crawford in that the idea of the perspective that she might take would foster more competition. You're arguing that you could promote competition by, in essence, having this managed care system on the internet. Help me understand that.
There are new technologies out there that don't operate like the old internet technologies. We're used to thinking of the internet growing up on a telephone world. A person I mentioned earlier in this hearing, during the vote, he's here. And he's doing wireless broadband. His name is Brett Glass. He represents a company called Lariat from Laramie, Wyoming. He's not one of the big existing players. And even among the big existing players, there are 4 wireless players. They depend on being really smart about how they route their traffic so that, one, they can provide the kind of services that consumers...
So let me stop here for a moment. What you're suggesting is a jammed up system means nobody can get on to a certain extent.
Correct.
So competition goes down because your, not clients, but those that you voice can't manage access or content. It's overloaded.
If the system gets overloaded, no one will use it, and you go out of business. You lose your subscribers, and you'll go out of business. Being able to provide a quality service that people will actually pay for instead of buying it from one of the existing options is what they need to survive. Part of the way that wireless players are doing it is by figuring out which stuff is which applications are extremely time sensitive, and to give them priority over the stuff where if it waits for a second or two, will not be...
Give me an example which is time sensitive. What would that be?
Voice. Or streaming video. If there's a hiccup in the video, you can stop watching it. If your voice service has a delay of 1/3 of a second, the studies show you'll stop using it. So they have
that means a telephone by cable.
Internet telephone, IP telephony. There's other examples, virtual worlds like Second Life, online games.
So, Mr. Kulash, you consider him having the ability to wait?
It's interesting. What he's doing is a streaming technology that is actually, you can buffer it, and it's less sensitive than real-time applications. In other words, when you launch YouTube to download Mr. Kulash's video, it's running ahead of where you're watching and actually storing it, and tends not to be extremely sensitive. The things that are very sensitive are games where you make a move, or if you're talking on...
And you need a response.
Immediately.
That's what I'm saying. Mr. Kulash, in your view, could function and have a success if he waited.
No, I'm saying that the network is smart enough to make sure that download applications like YouTube don't have to wait in general. And in fact, there are certain applications which can use other situations to get around the waiting problem, whether by storing it locally, by giving it different means. But the network's really nimble.
I think I got you. I see my time going. Let me get right to the First Amendment. Is Professor Yu pulling the wool over our eyes, and is what he is suggesting, because I think we should entertain the question of competitiveness. How does Professor Yu's reasonable perspective interfere with the First Amendment? Professor Crawford, and then Ms. Fredrickson and Mr. Kulash.
Just very briefly, Congresswoman, given the highly concentrated market we have right now for high-speed internet access, these gatekeepers are in the position of choosing speech, choosing winners and losers. And backing up, that's the principle that we're worried about.
Very quickly, because the time has expired.
Yeah, and in some ways, I was going to say there's a little bit of apples and oranges because I think, as Professor Crawford has already suggested, limiting access based on bandwidth or other non-discriminatory means could be considered as a way of managing a network, but what really cannot be allowed is doing so based on content.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Utah is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Carnes, you said earlier that 5% of the users are using 70% of the bandwidth and downloading peer-to-peer material. My sense is, and I don't know this, but I do a lot of YouTube. I mean, there's just some really interesting stuff on there. We put up YouTubes with my office. My sense is that those numbers have changed, and I asked that question because what I'm really going at is it seems to me that the Internet and the nature of what we're doing on the Internet has been changing very rapidly, and the rate of change is going to increase. So can you, when were those numbers validated that you gave us, and are they current or are they a couple of years old?
Those were the most recent numbers I had.
Is it maybe a couple of years ago or a year ago? You don't know?
You know, I couldn't tell you exactly.
Does anybody know? My sense is there's been a huge transformation about how bandwidth is used. Mr. Yu?
Those numbers have been validated within the last 6 months from at least 5 sources. They vary, obviously. I've seen 50 to 80%. The most extreme numbers is that 1% of it's 5% in 70 or 80.
Right.
It may be as much as 1% in 50. That if you take an even smaller slice of it, it might be even more intense.
Right. And is that all peer-to-peer and mostly pirating, or is the mix changing?
That number that we're talking about, 5% and 80, is peer-to-peer. And the mix of peer-to-peer is 90% piracy. And so the vast majority, you can do the math, it's 70-ish% is piracy.
Yes, Ms. Crawford, please.
Those uses are also changing, Congressman. We're seeing a lot of use of BitTorrent for sending around security patches for laptops, a lot of use of BitTorrent for making sure that developers stay in sync. It's a very efficient way of using the network so that you're not depending on central servers and on one piece of bandwidth, everybody sharing the bandwidth and the storage.
But you know, in the Grogster case, I think it was 2005, the figure is almost exactly the same. It was still 90% illegal. So they may be doing more, but apparently the illegal is growing too. So the ratio is still the same.
Mistress, if I may, it brings up a wonderful question, though, is what is the future going to be? For the last 4 years until the last year, peer-to-peer was outstripping downloads every year, and it looked like that was the shape of things to come. Last year, because of YouTube, downloads made a comeback, and they've now passed peer-to-peer. And the entire industry is staring at this. Should we redesign our entire networks because peer-to-peer is the answer? Or is it going to be, is YouTube the new thing? And even if we redesign it today, what's the next thing coming down? It's important to understand it's extremely uncertain what you have to do right now. There's more than $100 billion at stake. They're going to have to make a gamble, and that's what they're paid to do.
And just following up, when you say that they need to make a gamble, you've got very different architectures out there. And the gamble is gambling future investment in architectures that are dissimilar. And what is the effect of a mandate from government on those decisions about what architecture to choose?
In a free market economy, you let business people take chances. Some of them will work, guaranteed, some of them won't. And our normal system is to allow individual consumers through their individual buying decisions to determine the winners and losers, and not to have a centralized authority, whether government or private business, decide what that architecture is going to be.
Yes, Ms. Crawford, please.
Just very briefly, the follow-up to that is that it would be good if we had a functioning free market in internet access, but we really don't in this country.
Yeah, and one of the things I would like to see happen is that we stimulate the possibilities of what that infrastructure will be rather than limiting the possibilities, because we've seen an increase in availability of bandwidth. Yes, Mr. Carnes.
From the songwriter's perspective, we've had 10 years of dumb pipes as the internet, and it's hurt us. We're just hoping that an intelligent network can help us.
One of the things I'm hoping is that we can prosecute people that steal and then bring down the price enough so that the people are incented to do other things. I think Time Magazine had an editorial on its last page about Rob Reed doing an experiment with Rhapsody where he charged 25 cents per song, and instead of getting 4 songs, in other words, being equal, he got 6 songs sold in the same, so the 25 cent per song resulted in a 50% increase in revenues, and I'm hoping that people that have content will start to look at that model. and realize that by bringing the price down, two things happen. One is you get more revenue, and two is, why would you steal if you can pay a reasonably low price? But along the lines of how we have a system that actually accommodates more movement, and we have what I call the Super Bowl syndrome. If everybody downloads the Super Bowl over the same pipes, and in a neighborhood you got 300 households sucking the Super Bowl independently through the same pipe, you're going to have a problem with speed. If you use a model like Comcast and distribute that locally, then the backbone is not totally wiped out. But in that environment, how we use the radio frequency and other spectrums seem to be very important to me. Are any of you familiar with the M2Z project, and does that give us an opportunity to see how we can use bandwidth a little more effectively?
There's a number of fascinating projects underway, and we have no idea which are going to work. There's a P4P project that's on. There's BitTorrent DNA. All these different solutions are brewing out there, and technology is going so fast we don't ultimately know which one's going to win. I would love to see a wonderful battle between these different technologies unfold, and the only way we can allow that is if we give them breathing room to experiment with new ways of doing business.
Madam Chair, I recognize my time has passed, but I actually intended that question for Ms. Crawford. I thought that she had an answer if we could, if she could have the time to answer.
With unanimous consent, the gentleman is given another minute, so Ms. Crawford may respond.
M2Z.
Here's the point. Here's the point. We need a playing field for innovation. That's the point of network neutrality. Keeping the conduit players as conduits does not limit our opportunities as a nation for the future. All it's going to do is make sure that developers can attract investment because they can predict the kind of internet that they'll be able to run their new applications. Right now, we have uncertainty, which is clouding innovation, making it difficult to invest. Yes, we have to weigh benefits and burdens to different populations. As a society, social welfare will be served by a neutral internet in a way that it will not be served by making sure that these very few private companies are able to monetize the internet in the way they would like.
The gentleman's time has expired, and as you have noticed, we have been called for a vote on the floor of the House, and we are out of questions for members. So we will be adjourning this hearing with terrific thanks to each one of you. A lot of people don't realize that our witnesses are volunteers, and you're here just to help us do the right thing and make sure that our country's future is protected. So we do very much appreciate your participation in this hearing, and this hearing is now adjourned.
Sorry about that. You have to get back to New York now?
I didn't even sell a CD.